So if that part of Dodd-Frank had not been amended, both SVB and Signature Bank would have been classified as banks important to the system, which means they would have been regulated a lot more closely, and those danger signs would have been seen much earlier, even before this run on deposits and on SVB. If you are not a bank important to the system, you have the regular quarterly bank examinations, which typically are held at the last month of the quarter or fiscal quarter for the bank. Most of them are end of the year anyway. Hence, catching the effect of large mark-to-market losses of liquid assets is not as easy. So let's kind of look at, let's assume that the last bank examination was done at the end of, was completed at the end of December. We already have their assets. Their total assets at that time was 211 billion. And their total investment securities were 120 billion. That's kind of the liquidity that they keep, right? Let's look at the deposits. Non-interest bearing demand deposits, 80 billion. Interest bearing, 92. Total deposits, 173. Now, those non-interest bearing demand deposits are subject to bank runs. And I kind of knew this, but I didn't have that detailed access because I was an outside consultant. But a large portion of their deposits were from the tech firms. And there was very little insured deposits. You and I deposit to SVB up to $250,000. All our deposits are insured by FDIC or ACC or whichever the regulator is. But above that is not insured. In the case of these guys, I don't know the exact percent, but 80+% was uninsured. And most of them were from tech banks, tech firms, venture capital kind of firms, or the kind of firms venture capitals financed. Now, short-term interest rates went up quite a bit in the last year or so, from about 0.5% to 5% on 3-month rate. And it became a lot more difficult for startup firms or venture capital firms to raise money without paying a lot of interest. Hence, they wanted to increase their liquidity because most of these firms are not at a stage where they're making money yet. Some of them haven't even had any revenue. So they have a so-called cash burn rate. They're burning cash at a rate until they produce something they can sell or they can go IPO. So they needed cash at hand. If you leave it at SVB, you get nothing, right? They have, where is that amount? $80 billion demand deposits. You and I having demand deposits is one thing, but a corporation having demand deposits is another thing. It was probably a condition of the loans that they got, but suddenly there was a big run on the bank. I think there was about 20 plus billion dollars withdrawals. We're talking about 1/4 of the demand deposits. Because mostly interest-bearing deposits tend to be time deposits. You can't take them out without paying a significant cost. So they went after it. So, banks never hold free cash. Look at the assets. I mean, these are considered part of cash equivalents. If you actually look at the actual cash, let me view the Excel document. We'll get more details there. No. And the banks rarely keep cash at hand other than the vault cash, which tends to be rather small. And for a bank like SVB, that doesn't work that much with individuals. Even that vault cash wouldn't be that high. So what are they going to do? They are going to sell their liquid assets in order to cover it. And these held to maturity securities, available for sale securities, some of it was placed as collateral as well. They ended up realizing a loss of $18 billion. No, I'm sorry, $1.8 billion. Total, let's see, total stockholders' equity was $16 billion. That's 10% of the capital, okay? It's more than 10% of the capital, 1.8. Normally, these firms should have, roughly speaking, third-year capital to be considered healthy, 10 to 12%. So they were already around 8 to begin with. I mean, there is some third-year capital here. Some of that third-term debt, but just basic capital ratio was about 8%. Before Basel III or Basel III, basic capital ratio of 8 to 10 was considered healthy. Anything below 4 was a big danger sign. In fact, FDIC has a kind of a informal rule of thumb that says, if you go below 4, we're going to take you over. Either dissolve all the assets or sell the bank. So these guys were already kind of at the margin to begin with. If you lose 1.8, so basically 16,295 minus 1,800, that gets you below 7%. And depending upon your tier 3 stuff, it's kind of a big danger sign. They recognize this themselves, and they actually tried to raise $2 billion in capital, right? And when that search failed, the bank, Fed decided that they're going to take them in, and they did. Of course, because of the large, think about, of those 173 billion, more than likely 150 or more were uninsured deposits. Okay, that means you would have wiped out pretty much most of the venture capital sector, which has big impact on both and short-term and long-term growth. Even now, those firms are going to be affected because SVB was the biggest contributor to that sector. Other banks were not as eager. These guys had about $5 billion in assets around 2008. Since I worked with them, I know those numbers. They grew so much to $200 billion in assets within basically 15 years. And the project that we were working on was getting some sort of stress model for SVB. And we worked on a lot of stuff, effect of what you want to call recessions, deep recessions and stuff. But one thing that we weren't asked to do, because the client asks you to do certain things, is the effect of increases in interest rates or a large deposit, large bank run. Now we see the effect. So that's the, first one. Two, bank executives. They held about 60% of their assets in liquid securities, and mostly in treasury bonds. They had to realize a loss of 1.8 billion when they sold about 22 billion worth of T bonds. Now, if they were marking them to market, they would have seen a lot of those realized losses. They would have shown people a lot of those realized losses much earlier. And B, this shows that they took too much interest rate risk. If you own a 30-year bond, roughly speaking,